Millionaire single dad witnessed a stranger holding his lost child. What she whispered left him froze. Millionaire single dad witnessed a stranger holding his lost child. What she whispered left him froze. Ivy. Lucas's voice rang out, cracking like thunder, slicing through the noise of the busy autumn harvest festival. Laughter echoed around him. Leaves crunched beneath the crowd's boots. The faint sounds of music floated from the main stage. But none of it mattered to Lucas. His world had shrunk to one paralyzing thought. His daughter was gone. Ivy? His voice broke as he spun around, eyes darting to every corner, searching for the little white dress and the bunny plush she'd always clutched in her tiny hands. She had been right there, just moments ago. He had bent down to tie his shoe, and when he looked up, she was gone. Ivy? Panic twisted in his stomach, turning it to stone. He shoved past people, apologizing absent-mindedly, checking under benches, near booths, and behind stacks of hay. His heart pounded, growing heavier with each step. This was supposed to be their first outing since Emma died, a simple trip to the festival. He had hoped the laughter, the color, the life would somehow bring Ivy back from the silence that had swallowed her after Emma's passing. Ivy hadn't spoken in months. She hadn't cried, smiled, or even made a sound. She just clung to that bunny, looking at the world as if it no longer made sense. He thought today might change something, might bring her back. Now, it felt as though the ground had given way beneath him. Ivy! His voice cracked again, louder this time, and people started to notice. But no one had seen her. No one had noticed. Lucas's eyes shifted to the orchard section of the fairgrounds, his breath quickening. Something about the stillness there caught his attention. Under the shade of a large maple tree, a woman sat on a blanket, holding Ivy in her lap. Ivy wasn't crying, wasn't trembling. She wasn't huddled in fear. She sat still, her head resting against the stranger's shoulder. And the woman was singing. Lucas took a step forward, then another, his eyes wide with disbelief. The melody was soft. It tugged at something deep inside him, something he hadn't realized he missed. His breath caught in his chest. No, it couldn't be. It was that song, the lullaby, the one Emma had made up, the one she sang to Ivy every night before bed. Lucas never wrote it down, never recorded it. It was theirs, their private melody. No one else had ever known it. No one else had ever known that song. But this woman sang it with such perfect, aching precision. Her voice was soft, yet rough around the edges, like an old record playing a beloved melody that hadn't been heard in years. Lucas felt as though the air had left his lungs. The woman had long blonde hair, braided neatly, and wore a pale cardigan and jeans. There was nothing extraordinary about her appearance, but there was something about her, something calming, as if time itself had paused just for her, and Ivy, his Ivy, was letting this stranger hold her. That was what took Lucas by surprise the most. Since Emma's death, Ivy had recoiled from touch, especially from anyone she didn't know. Lucas had watched her scream when even the kindest neighbors tried to say hello. He'd seen her shake her head violently when therapists tried to sit too close. Yet now, she was curled into this woman's lap, clutching her bunny, pressing her little face against the woman's chest. Lucas took a step closer, his heart racing. The woman opened her eyes and glanced at him, their gazes locked, his filled with fear and confusion, hers calm, unbothered. She gave a small nod, acknowledging his presence. Slowly, Lucas knelt down beside them. "I'm her father," he said, his voice trembling. Another small nod from the woman. She looked down at Ivy, then stopped singing, gently rubbing her back. She was lost, the woman said softly, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. She was scared. I just sat down, and she came to me. Lucas's gaze shifted to Ivy. Her small hand was still curled into the woman's sweater, but she didn't pull away. He looked back at the stranger, his words sharp. "How do you know that song?" The woman hesitated. Her lips parted, but no answer came. Lucas leaned in closer, insistent. "That lullaby, how do you know it?" She lowered her gaze, the words slipping from her lips like a secret. I knew it might help." At that moment, Ivy shifted slightly, her eyes opening. She looked up at the woman, then, sensing Lucas's presence, slowly turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were clear, calmer than Lucas had seen in months. Then, without a word, Ivy reached out, her small hand seeking his. Still resting in the woman's arms, she clutched his fingers gently. Lucas looked down at his daughter, then at the woman who had somehow sung the only song that belonged to Emma. His world shifted. The change so quiet, so sudden. He didn't understand what had just happened, but something deep inside told him that everything had changed. For the next while, Lucas sat stiffly on the park bench, Ivy curled peacefully in his arms. The stranger, Hannah, sat a few feet away, her hands folded, eyes cast down. She had introduced herself as Hannah Wells. Lucas studied her closely, the long blonde braid, soft sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, and the rough, uncertain quality to her voice, like someone trying to remember how to speak again. There was nothing menacing about her, nothing intentional or calculated, but there was something about her he couldn't quite explain. He tightened his hold on Ivy. "I just want to understand," he said finally, breaking the silence. "That song, my wife wrote it. She only ever sang it to Ivy. She never shared it with anyone. How did you know it?" Hannah slowly lifted her eyes, meeting his. In her green eyes, Lucas saw something raw, not guilt, fear, or regret, but something he couldn't name. She didn't answer. Lucas's jaw clenched. "That's not something you just guess. It's not a popular lullaby. She made it up for Ivy." Hannah parted her lips to speak, then closed them again. Her fingers gripped the edge of the bench tightly, her face tense. For a long moment, she seemed to be battling something inside. Then, in a whisper, she said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. Or her. I heard her crying, and I didn't know what else to do." Lucas's voice softened, but his confusion remained. "But the song, you knew it perfectly." Another long pause. Hannah stared at her hands before finally speaking, her voice low. "I heard it once, a long time ago." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Where?" he asked again, his voice edged with disbelief. She hesitated, and this time, Lucas noticed something deeper. It wasn't that she was hiding something to deceive him. It was that she was protecting something, or someone. When she spoke again, her voice trembled. "There was a video, years ago online. It was short, just a mother singing to her baby. I didn't know who she was. I only saw it once." Lucas's breath caught. He remembered now. Emma had let a friend record a short clip just that once. It had been shared anonymously on a parenting blog and then forgotten. He hadn't thought about it in years, hadn't even known it was still out there. But somehow, Hannah had seen it and remembered. She looked up at him, her voice even softer now. "I lost my voice in an accident. I was 21. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit me hard. I was in the hospital for weeks," Hannah continued, her voice growing quieter. "My vocal cords were damaged. I couldn't speak for 5 years." Lucas stared at her, stunned by the weight of her words. "I was trying to learn again," she went on, her gaze distant. "Sound, rhythm, emotion, That video, your wife's voice. It was the first time I could follow the lullaby. It helped me find my way back to speaking. I didn't know who she was. I just never forgot the sound." Her voice faltered, cracking on the last word, and she turned her face away. Lucas remained silent. His instincts, sharp from years of boardrooms and negotiations, told him one thing. This woman was telling the truth. She had no reason to lie, no hidden motive, no agenda, only memory, music, and grief. He looked down at Ivy, who was still clutching her bunny, her eyes half-lidded with sleep. Then, something unexpected happened. Ivy's tiny fingers slipped from his shirt and reached out, not to him, but to Hannah. She touched the edge of the woman's sleeve, her touch tentative. Hannah blinked, surprised. Ivy shifted slightly, and then, very slowly, she leaned her hand into Hannah's palm. A beat passed, and then Ivy looked up at her and smiled. It was small, uncertain, but it was real. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. It was the first smile he had seen from Ivy since Emma's death, since the funeral, since the silence. He looked back at Hannah, who was equally stunned. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, almost as if afraid they would shatter the fragile moment. Lucas didn't understand what had just happened, but he knew it meant something. Something had begun, quietly, unexpectedly. Perhaps in this strange, broken way, the healing had started. The next time Hannah saw Ivy, the little girl walked right up to her and silently held up her bunny. Lucas, observing from a distance, still couldn't fully grasp what was happening, but he knew this much. Ivy, who used to flinch at the slightest touch, was now resting her head on Hannah's shoulder without hesitation. So Lucas invited Hannah back again, and again. By the end of the week, she had visited 4 times. Each time, Ivy sat a little closer, played a little more, and even started drawing with brighter colors. She still didn't speak, but the weight of her silence had lightened. Sometimes she would hum soft, low melodies under her breath, especially when Hannah was near. Lucas had never seen Ivy hold a crayon since Emma's funeral. Soon, Ivy began handing Hannah drawings, blurry, wobbly shapes of 3 figures standing together in a garden. Always the same 3, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman with yellow hair. Hannah never pointed it out. She never made a fuss about it. Instead, she just smiled softly and asked Ivy to tell her more through pictures. Lucas noticed how Hannah never pressured Ivy. She didn't push her to speak or respond in any particular way. Instead, she communicated with gentle gestures, soft words, and a quiet patience. Sometimes it was with picture books or cards. Other times with just the rhythm of her voice or the expressions on her face. It was in the way she sat beside Ivy, calm and still, that reminded Lucas so much of Emma in her quietest moments. One afternoon, Ivy had a nightmare during nap time. Lucas was in the hallway when he heard her soft sobs. He rushed in, but Hannah was already there, kneeling beside the couch. "It's okay, sweetheart," Hannah whispered gently. "Can I show you something?" She took Ivy's small hand and placed it gently on her chest. "Feel that?" she said. "That's my heartbeat. It means I'm here. You're not alone." Ivy hiccuped through her tears, her hand still resting on Hannah's chest. Then slowly, Ivy mirrored the gesture, placing Hannah's hand over her own heart. Lucas, standing just outside the room, felt something stir deep inside him. It wasn't pain this time, not helplessness, but something else. Hope. After Hannah left that evening, Lucas found Ivy's sketchpad on the table. Flipping through the pages, he stopped at one drawing. It showed 2 women standing side by side, one with long black hair, the other with yellow. Emma and Hannah. They were drawn as if they were friends. Lucas stared at the picture for a long time, unsure of how to feel. It was too soon to even consider the thought of another woman stepping into Ivy's or his emotional space, but the drawing was Ivy's, her voice, her decision. Somehow, she had already let Hannah in. That night, unable to sleep, Lucas stepped out onto the back patio for some air, still holding Ivy's sketchbook. The moon hung high in the sky. The garden was quiet, the air still. Then he heard it, soft, barely a whisper, a melody drifting through the night. Lucas followed the sound, rounding the corner of the house. There, beneath the weeping willow, sat Hannah, alone. Her eyes were closed, her face tilted slightly upward, and she was singing the lullaby. It wasn't loud, just for herself. Her voice cracked in places, as if she wasn't used to singing so freely. Her hands trembled as they rested in her lap. But the emotion behind the song was undeniable. Lucas didn't interrupt. He just stood there listening, and in that moment, he realized something. She wasn't singing for Ivy. She was singing for herself, for the girl who had been voiceless for years, for the pain she had carried in silence, for the memory of a song that had once helped her find her way out of the dark. Something shifted in Lucas's chest. For so long, his grief had been like a stone, unmoving, solid, cold. But now, watching this woman who had rebuilt her voice from brokenness, he felt that grief stir. When Hannah finally opened her eyes and noticed him, she didn't speak right away. She simply gave him a soft, slightly embarrassed smile. Lucas returned it, his gaze then falling to the sketchbook in his hands. He held it out to her. "She drew this today," he said quietly. "She put you next to her mom." Hannah blinked, her breath catching. Lucas added softly, "She doesn't draw people unless they matter." Hannah took the drawing carefully, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, then glanced up at the moon, "for letting me stay." Lucas didn't answer right away, but instead sat beside her on the bench. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence wasn't empty. Sometimes it was full of everything that couldn't yet be said. Later, when Lucas invited Hannah inside, the house was quiet. It had been weeks since the day at the festival, and Hannah's presence had woven itself into the rhythm of their lives. Not constant, not expected, but somehow natural. This time, though, Lucas had something to show her. He led her through the hallway to his study, passing the family photos he still hadn't been able to take down. Ivy was asleep upstairs, Bunny tucked under her chin, and the silence of the house felt different now. Not empty, just waiting. Lucas paused at the door before opening it. Inside, the room was dimly lit. He walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a small external drive. Plugging it into the laptop, he hesitated for a moment before clicking on the file. "I haven't watched this in a long time," he said, barely above a whisper. Hannah nodded. Sitting quietly at the edge of the sofa, the video began to load. There was Emma, barefoot in the nursery, cradling Ivy in her arms. She swayed gently as she sang, her voice soft and warm. Little Ivy, just a baby, blinked up at her with wide eyes. The camera angle was shaky. Clearly, a friend had filmed it quickly years ago. Emma had laughed about it later. "Just in case I'm not around someday," she had said. Lucas had brushed it off at the time, but now every second of it felt precious. As the lullaby played, Lucas sat beside Hannah, arms crossed tightly, trying to steady his breath. But something broke inside him when he heard the last line, the line Emma had always whispered. "Even when I'm not near, love will find you in the dark." He turned his face slightly away, not wanting her to see the tears gathering in his eyes or the way his jaw trembled. He thought he was hiding it well, But Hannah didn't say anything. She didn't reach out. She simply allowed the silence to hold space for his grief. When the video ended, she stared at the black screen, blinking slowly. "That was it?" she asked softly. "That's the video?" Lucas looked at her, confused. "The one I saw when I couldn't speak," she explained. "It was short, just a few seconds, but I watched it every night for months. Not for the music, not for the words. It was the way she held Ivy." Lucas leaned back, his chest tightening. "I didn't know it was posted publicly," he murmured. "Emma did it quietly. She said she wanted to leave a part of herself behind, just in case. I thought she was being dramatic," he added quietly. Hannah swallowed hard. "I had nothing, Lucas. No voice, no sound. That video, it was the first time I saw love I could feel. It was real. I studied it, mimicked the sound, the pitch. When I finally spoke again, her voice was the one in my mind." Lucas stared at her, stunned. The silence between them deepened, not with awkwardness, but with understanding, with grief that had long been searching for a mirror. And then, barely a whisper, Hannah spoke. "Your wife taught me how to speak, even when I had no voice." Lucas didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he slowly reached across the small space between them and took her hand. He didn't squeeze it, didn't look at her. He simply held it, and she let him. Their hands rested together, quietly, between them. Neither moved. The room, once filled with the shadows of the past, now felt filled with something new, something soft, something real. Lucas finally met her gaze, his eyes still rimmed with red. Before Hannah, she had drawn something simpler than usual, less vibrant. It showed Hannah with wings, the same ones Ivy had drawn so many times before. But this time, one of the wings was broken. Lucas didn't ask why. He just put on his coat and left. It was a light, steady rain when he reached Hannah's apartment. The building manager recognized him and let him up without question. When he knocked, there was no answer at first. Then the door creaked open, just a crack. Hannah stood there, her eyes rimmed with red. A blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile, as if the silence had hollowed her out. Lucas didn't ask why she'd disappeared or press for answers. He simply stood there until she stepped aside, letting him in with a quiet nod. Inside, the room was dim. The piano lid was shut. Torn sheet music scattered across the floor. On the coffee table, a small notepad lay open. Hannah sat slowly, picked up the pen, and wrote in neat, looping script, "I didn't need to speak to fall in love with you." She slid the paper toward him, her hand hovering just an inch from his. Her eyes didn't meet his, but her shoulders trembled once, faintly. Lucas looked at the words, then at her, before crossing the space between them in 2 strides. He sat beside her silently and wrapped his arms gently around her. She didn't pull away. Her body melted into his, as if returning home. He didn't try to fix her silence, didn't pretend to be strong for her. He simply held her, long and steady, letting her feel that she was not alone. Not then. Not ever again. A month passed since the day Hannah lost her voice, and then, gradually, it returned. There was no dramatic moment. It came back quietly, like a shy guest knocking softly at the edge of her breath, testing each word with the same hesitation she knew so well. But this time, unlike before, it returned to a space that had been waiting for it. Lucas had kept his distance, respectfully, but not absent. Every few days, he left small pieces of himself behind, a gentle message, a book at her door, sometimes just a daisy taped to her mailbox. He never asked for her voice. He simply let her know, "I still hear you even when you cannot speak." Then came her text. "I'd like to see you and Ivy." Lucas responded almost immediately. "Come Saturday to Ivy's favorite place. We'll bring the sandwiches. You bring your smile." And so, on a warm afternoon, with the sky stretched wide and blue above the quiet hills, Hannah arrived at the meadow's edge. Lucas was already there, spreading a blanket beneath a willow tree. Ivy sat cross-legged, a basket of juice boxes and cookies beside her. When Ivy saw Hannah, she leapt to her feet and ran towards her, arms wide and face glowing. But what happened next caught them all by surprise. Ivy threw her arms around Hannah's waist, and in a clear, measured voice, she whispered, "Mom says, thank you for singing to me." Lucas froze. It was the first full sentence Ivy had spoken since the accident. Hannah dropped to her knees, tears springing to her eyes before she could stop them. She held Ivy close, her hands trembling. It wasn't just a breakthrough. It was a bridge across every silence they had carried. Lucas in his grief, Ivy in her trauma, Hannah in her fear. Later, as the sun began to lower and the shadows stretched long across the grass, Lucas reached into the basket and pulled out a small velvet box. He handed it to Ivy. The little girl opened it slowly, and a soft, delighted sound escaped her lips. Inside were 2 simple leather bracelets, each engraved with the same words. "You found her when I was lost, and you found me too." Lucas looked at Hannah, his voice barely more than a murmur. "She wanted to be the one to give this to you." Ivy nodded seriously, then reached up and slipped one of the bracelets onto Hannah's wrist. It was small, but the gesture felt ancient, almost like a blessing or a transfer of light from one heart to another. Without instruction, Ivy placed the second bracelet on her own wrist and smiled. Hannah looked at Lucas, her eyes bright with something that felt like love, but deeper, steadier, uncertain. Saying nothing, Lucas stepped forward, took Hannah's hand, turned it gently in his, and secured the bracelet. Then, without letting go, he brought her hand to his chest and placed it flat over his heart. He held it there, steady, quiet. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that moment, without rings, vows, or a single word spoken, their story wrote its next chapter. And it was enough. 1 year later, the building on the corner of Elm and 13th no longer looked abandoned. Its windows glowed warmly in the evening light, and soft melodies drifted from inside. Songs not crafted for performance, but offered as medicine for the soul. The sign above the door read, "The Voice Within." Inside, children sat in small groups. Some hummed, some tapped rhythms on drums, and others clung to handmade instruments like they were precious treasures. Lifelines in a world that sometimes felt too large. On the far wall, a mural stretched across, depicting open hands with musical notes sprouting like wildflowers from their palms. Lucas and Hannah stood side by side, watching as Ivy gently guided a new student through a breathing exercise. She was calm, patient, reflecting the same care that had once been shown to her. Her hair, now longer, was braided loosely like Hannah's. Her smile, once fleeting, had become more natural, staying longer. She was thriving. She was singing again, no longer afraid. The center had grown steadily, not through big investments or flashy reputations, but through word of mouth and the quiet strength of stories shared between parents of children who had once fallen silent. It wasn't therapy in the conventional sense. It was a sanctuary, a place where no one needed to explain why their voice faltered, or why, sometimes, it didn't come at all. At the front of the room, a small platform had been set up for the opening celebration. Families gathered on soft cushions, and the walls were adorned with twinkling lights, like stars come to rest indoors. Hannah stepped forward, microphone in hand, though she barely needed it. Her voice had returned months ago, steady and confident. But tonight, it wasn't just her voice the room was waiting to hear. "I'd like to invite someone very special," she said softly. "The girl who taught me that even silence has its own music." Ivy bounded up beside her, holding Hannah's hand. The room fell into quiet anticipation. Slowly, Ivy began to sing. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than that. The song was Emma's lullaby, the same one that had once lived only in memory and in one anonymous video. Now, Ivy sang it with Hannah beside her. Two voices met in the middle of every note, a mother and a daughter, a teacher and a student, the past and the future. When the song ended, there was no immediate applause, not right away. The room was too busy holding its breath, its hearts full. It wasn't until Ivy giggled and took a little bow that the room exhaled, laughter and tears mingling in a harmony that echoed the very song they had just heard. Afterward, as guests mingled and sunlight poured through the tall windows, Lucas pulled Hannah aside into a quiet corner of the center they had created together. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For everything." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she handed him a copy of the book she had just published. The cover was simple, white with gold-embossed letters reading, "The Voice That Found Me." Inside, the dedication read, "To Ivy, to Emma, and to the man who listened even when I couldn't speak." Lucas ran his thumb over the spine of the book before meeting Hannah's gaze. There was no surprise in his eyes, nor pride. It was something deeper, understanding. That evening, the three of them sat beneath a tree in the garden behind the center, watching as paper lanterns drifted into the twilight sky. Ivy curled up between them, her head resting gently on Hannah's arm. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Now I have two voices, Mommy's lullaby and Hannah's heart." Neither Lucas nor Hannah replied. They simply leaned closer to Ivy, letting the silence speak for them. It was no longer the silence of loss. It was the silence of peace, of a home that had found its place. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you that healing can come quietly and love often speaks loudest without words, then imagine how many more stories are waiting for you here. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more unforgettable tales that comfort, heal, and remind us all of the beauty and second chances, quiet bravery, and chosen families. Let these stories be the soft voice you need on hard days. Tap subscribe, hit the bell, and join our growing family of hearts who still believe in the power of a well-LD story.